Hello, I'm Dr. Lynda Yorke and I'm a geographer here in the School of Natural Sciences at Bangor University. And you know what? I love geography and I want to just talk a little bit about something that I'm really interested in and I hope that will interest you. And that is global challenges and thinking about geographical solutions. And I think, from that little cartoon on the slide there, you can probably have an inkling of where I'm going to go with this little sort of taster talk for you. And it is very much sort of focused around what's happening. It's certainly in the news a lot and it's certainly what's happening around us. But I'm going to start with an image that I think really brings this home. So what you can see here is what we call a global temperature change stripe map. It says at the bottom, there's a link there, show your stripes. And I think what you'll understand from this is you can see how global temperature has been changing since around 1850 when records began. And this map, I shouldn't call it a map, it's sort of an image really, but it does map out how temperature has changed and actually how rapidly. If you look through the sort of latter half of the 19th century throughout the 20th century, it really wasn't until we got to the end of the 20th century and into our current 21st century, those stripes really have changed colour into the red. So, if you want an image that kind of says to you, gosh, look what's happening, I think this is the one that does it. It really shows us that our climate has been warming in the last sort of 170 years. And we know that that is linked in with sort of this underlying sort of climate change. And if we think about a global challenge, I don't think you can get a bigger one at the moment if we say climate change. But there's a few things I think we should be thinking about that kind of helps contextualize this and really situates climate change in a global framework. And that's really what geography is about, situating what we understand around us but in a bigger framework. So I've no doubt that you will have heard of globalization, whether it's, said in the news or you've discussed it in some of your studies so far. And, globalization's been around for quite a significant amount of time. It's really, linked to the idea of modernity and modernization, how we became to be and live as we are, those changes that we saw in the sort of 19th century when, we had, global expansion, we became much more interconnected and we changed as a society. And really, sort of, I suppose, globalization embodies a couple of things. It embodies the way that peoples and governments operate in what we would call the global north, or you may have heard the term sort of westernized sort of countries, but we tend to use this term global north and global south to sort of differentiate between countries of different sort of statuses in terms of economy and development and prosperity. But really this idea when we had globalization was this fundamental shift, and we started to think about materiality and material sort of gain and material wealth at the expense of worrying about risk and maybe the consequences of what we were doing. And really it changed as it sort of saying there, we benefited some people, but really this idea of globalization was kind of at the expense of some of the poorest in basically our societies, but also in the global society. We don't have an equal kind of world. We don't live in an equal world. And I think, if we're thinking about geography, that's a really sort of startling sort of realization that we need to recognize that we live in an unequal world. And again, it feeds into, okay, we've got climate change, we've got globalization, maybe we've got an unequal world. This is something that we need to think about. But also this idea of globalization is this fundamental kind of shift, from the way that we did live to really this intensive sort of industrialization has of course been the source of many of our problems that we're seeing now. That idea that we had increased economic activity that was driven by industrialization, that came through the development of, large scale fossil fuel exploitation, of course, has been shown to contribute to global warming, which of course then leads us into sort of climate change. So we've had this sort of recognition, and it's been around for a while. It's not a secret that industrialization and fossil fuel exploitation was leading to climate change. But I think what's sort of really shifted quite recently is that more and more people are understanding that this is happening, and more people, you only have to look at Greta Thunberg, who's really, galvanized a lot of people and a lot of feeling that it's high on the agenda, and it's something that we've really sort of got to think about. And it's good that we're recognizing sort of, I suppose, where some of these challenges come from. You need to understand the past to think about something as a solution for the future. So if we sort of take this again forward, thinking about sort of, I suppose, global change and what that can mean. We've talked about global change in terms of sort of modernity and, how economies change, how we become sort of a more developed sort of nation or nations in the global north. But also, I think, thinking about that idea that we've got natural process change, we're accepting that actually humans, we are agents of change, but also thinking about it from a sort of socio-economic, so considering, you're not just considering natural processes, but you're thinking about social processes, you're thinking about economic processes. We could throw into there, political change. That has a huge impact in terms of potential sort of challenges. But ultimately it's kind of this whole run to maternity, this idea of globalization, and the fact that we're seeing global change has actually resulted in the world and the world around us being a much more complicated place. It's a much more vulnerable place, particularly for certain disadvantaged groups, nations, locations. And I think, we need to be thinking about that. If we think about what might happen in the future, understanding how we work as a nation, but understanding our place within that global sort of network, and actually understanding that the actions that perhaps we have in one part of the world has consequences for the other part of the world is really quite important. But also, if we think about how connected we are, we don't live in isolation. We may be an island sort of nation, but actually we're intimately connected with the world around us. When you order things off Amazon, it might be coming from a distribution site in Germany, or it might be being sent over from the United States or halfway around the world. We're very interconnected. And of course, the idea that our systems and our processes are interconnected then starts to tell us something about potential problems going forwards. Because if we have a disaster that befalls one part of the world, but our systems are linked hand in hand with another part of the world, that interconnectedness, that disaster sort of that kind of starts small can ripple out, and it can affect other parts of the world. And of course, that's really important. We've seen it, very much. I sort of don't want to touch on COVID-19, but I don't think you can ignore it. It's an example of how interconnected we are, and how those something that started in one part of the world has rippled out, and because of the way that we operate, it's kind of affected us. So that's really quite a nice example. Okay, but what I want to think about, it kind of links back to what I was talking about initially. We had that lovely sort of climate stripe sort of image. If we're thinking going forwards about, well, what does that mean? We can see that we're in a warming world, and we understand that if we're in a warming world, and that's what geographers do, they look at, how does the natural system operate? If we have warming in the atmosphere or warming in the oceans, how does that then impact our weather systems? How does that potentially impact our climate? And actually, some of the things that have been discussed and are starting to be recorded are these kind of climate related disasters. And I will come a little bit onto disasters towards the end of my little taster here. But if we think about potentially, future climate related sort of incidences, if we're in a warming climate, the Earth is getting hotter. There are particular parts of the world. In fact, I popped this image in particularly because this was related to what was happening in the west coast of America in California, in San Francisco, where they've seen really extensive wildfires or bushfires. Australia is another example. There have actually been wildfires in the Arctic as well last summer, and it's all connected with this idea that we have a warming climate, and areas become particularly parched. They're not receiving the rainfall that they would normally have. It becomes tinder dry, and of course you then get sort of wildfires starting. And of course, if we know that we've got this warming climate, then potentially one of our future sort of related sort of issues are going to be linked to droughts or wildfires. And obviously when I talk about disaster, or I mention disaster, we're thinking about the impacts on human life, human society. If you have a wildfire where nobody lives, yes, it might be a sort of ecological disaster, but it's not a disaster that's affecting humans. Really, we need to be thinking about all of these things together. Something else you might have seen more recently in the news, is thinking about, on the one hand, that example before I was talking about droughts and about wildfires. Here I'm looking at the exact opposite. It kind of fits with my little cartoon at the beginning, I hope you realise. But that the idea that actually there is, because there's more heat in the oceans, more heat in the atmosphere, we're getting actually more energy in the atmosphere. We're seeing places across the globe where we're having greater precipitation, so bigger amounts of rainfall, and of course bigger amounts of rainfall necessitate or lead to significant amounts of flooding. And again, this was an example from France from last year, where again we saw some really big sort of precipitation events, and you can see the scale of the damage there, just in terms of taking out the road and the bridge, and the sheer amount of sort of damage that's coming from that. I mean, there are other things we can think about in terms of sort of future climate related disasters. So things like global sea level rise, loss of coastal lands. Again, you've probably heard about some of the island nations in the South Pacific that are really starting to suffer with some of these sort of sea level related changes. And of course, the other end of that, scale, or one of the driving sort of mechanisms is, the loss of Arctic sea ice, but more particularly if we're starting to lose ice on big land-based ice masses, then we're going to see sea level rise pretty quickly. So there's a lot of things we can kind of think about when we think about what potentially we'll see in the future. And I've kind of given some hints, I suppose, about what the effects, might be. And I think an image like this one kind of helps you understand that a little bit. The top two images are kind of reflective of that wildfire or that drought. And of course, that can then have problems, in terms of where you can live, but also how do you feed yourselves, that's going to have problems. And again, if we think about interconnectedness, our food that we eat in this country, for example, doesn't just come from the UK. We're globally connected. It's globalization again. And then, if you look at the bottom two images, you know, you can kind of think, well, why has she got an image of, you know, high rise? But actually, we may well see that there is increased urban pressure as people have to move away, and you know, this idea that we have sort of forced climate migrants, because you know this idea, it's not, you know, it's not an idea, we are seeing it happen, this idea that people are having to migrate from areas where it's, you know, it's difficult to live, they're facing increasing problems. There's actually, you know, a disaster in waiting. So, you know, we can, you know, not just think about the physicality of, you know, what causes some of these changes that we see, but also how it fits into maybe some of the social, economic, political governance ideas that we need to be addressing and thinking about. And, you know, like I say, geography really does sit across that broad boundary. So I've mentioned disasters a couple of times in my little sort of talk here, and you might have heard the term natural disasters, and it kind of makes me cringe. And the reason it does that, and why there's actually a big push in geography and in research more generally, is this idea to move away from this terminology of natural disasters, because actually disasters aren't natural. You can have natural hazards, natural events, but actually the ensuing disaster, the ensuing impact on people, place, communities, countries is not a natural process. It's actually really linked up with the idea of preparedness. And you might have heard this as the term resilience. We hear it quite a lot. And resilience is really about having that preparedness, being aware of what's coming next and actually taking action to address that. So there's a nice little link there that you can go and have a look at this sort of information, a bit more detail. But going forward, no natural disasters. It really is about a disaster that is a consequence of the lack of preparedness. And if you want to flip that to what we're talking about here, about future related climate risk and climate change, you know, if we're not preparing for that, that is most definitely not a natural disaster. We can see what's happening. We need to take action. So just to kind of bring everything, I suppose, together here. So this little diagram's quite nice. It's really a way of thinking quite positively about, I suppose, the interactions between different aspects of geography, but also tying in that idea of sort of addressing disasters and disaster risk reduction. You know, we can understand that we have extreme events, and we can understand that from a very physical perspective, but also, you know, monitoring and looking at long-term change. We can also look at society and look at the vulnerabilities within society. Now, it's not to say that if we have more extreme events and we've got a more vulnerable population, we necessitate a disaster, because actually if we've got a disaster risk reduction plan in place, if we're preparing to address some of these problems, actually we can mitigate and reduce it. But that idea that we need to look at this holistically, so we need to take all the different elements of this diagram and really think about how we address some of those problems. So one of the ways we can do that is thinking about global cooperation. And I think, you know, that's really important. You know, we don't, as I say, you know, we globalization, you can look at it as sort of a negative thing, and you know, but actually what it has done is it's brought communities closer together. And, you know, that's really how we're going to come up with some of these solutions. It won't come from one country, it'll come from several countries, it'll come from global countries. You might have heard of the Paris Agreement, where there was countries that have signed up, particularly in the global north, that have signed up to address their sort of fossil fuel emissions, and that idea that, you know, we're recognizing that we're having an influence on our climate, we're recognising that we're potentially moving into a new geological era, and you can see I've popped that on the screen, you might have heard this term, you might not, the Anthropocene, and that really is recognising that there's been anthropogenic, so people's influence on our climate, but also to address these changes that we know are coming through. We've really got to be working together as a community, but we've also got to be thinking about these multiple layers of interconnectivity, but also looking at things not just from a physical understanding of, the physical mechanism of what drives climate change, but also what are the social dimensions of climate change? What are the political and economic sort of systems in which we operate? It really is about thinking about our world as a set of connections that you don't look at independently, and you need to work together to kind of address some of those issues. So I'm going to come back to my last slide, which is why geography is awesome. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of a taster about sort of, I suppose, the things I'm really interested in terms of geography. I am really fascinated, how the world around us changes, but also, why it's changing. And I think, if you're thinking about studying geography at university, then, it's that idea that your subject really is a bridge between the social and the natural sciences. It's giving you a really big view of the world, but it's helping you look at it in an interdisciplinary way. So we're looking, we're not just looking at it from a physical perspective, we're looking at it from maybe a social, a political, and environmental perspective, and we're looking at how those things work together. And I think, it does help you understand the how do things happen, but it also gets you to question the why things are happening. And they're really important questions to be asking about the world around us and how it's changing and why it's changing. But, to bring it back to my kind of title of this little taster slide, I'd sort of said global challenges, geographical solutions. Well, we understand and we recognise that there are global challenges, and that's really important. But also the way we look at the world from a geographical perspective is really helping to come up with some of the solutions. It's not just, looking at it from one side of the coin. Geography really looks at it from both sides of the coin. And actually, when you're looking at it more widely, it really will help to come up with some of these solutions. And that's what geography is. And wherever there is a challenge or a problem in the world at the moment, you can guarantee there is a geographer looking at that and trying to think about, well, how can we change this for the better? What is it that we can do to come up with solutions? And I think for me, that's why geography is awesome.